the Prairie Prophet, the trials of Abraham Lincoln, the crucible of the frontier. To understand the man who saved the Union, one must first understand the mud, the silence, and the isolation of the Kentucky and Indiana wilderness. Abraham Lincoln was born in 1809, not into a world of soaring rhetoric, but into a world of the short and simple annals of the poor. His childhood was marked by a series of erasures. First, the loss of his mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, to milk sickness when he was only 9 years old, an event that left a permanent crater in his psyche. Then, the death of his sister, Sarah. These early brushes with mortality birthed the melancholy that his friends later noted was so thick it seemed to drip from him as he walked. Lincoln's relationship with his father, Thomas, was one of quiet friction. Thomas was a man of the earth, a carpenter and farmer who viewed his son's obsession with books as a form of laziness. Yet, young Lincoln would walk miles to borrow a copy of Aesop's Fables or The Pilgrim's Progress. He was a self-made intellect, carving his math problems into the back of a wooden shovel by the light of a fire. This transition from physical labor, the rail splitting, that would later become a campaign mythos, to the labor of the mind, was his first great rebellion. When he finally left home for New Salem, Illinois, he was a giant of a man, 6'4", with a high, reedy voice, and a storehouse of ribald jokes and folk wisdom that masked a razor-sharp logical faculty. The New Salem years and the law. New Salem was Lincoln's university. It was here he failed as a storekeeper, served as a postmaster, and began to study the law. He was a man of the people, wrestling the Clary's Grove boys to earn their respect. Yet he spent his nights reading Blackstone's commentaries. His entry into the Illinois state legislature marked the beginning of his transformation from a local character into a Whig politician. He was a protege of Henry Clay, a believer in internal improvements, railroads, canals, and banks that would lift the poor man out of the dirt, just as he had lifted himself. His marriage to Mary Todd in 1842 was a collision of two vastly different worlds. Mary was high-strung, educated, and aristocratic. Lincoln was rumpled, distracted, and prone to the blues. Their home in Springfield became a theater of domestic intensity and tragedy, as they would eventually bury 3 of their 4 sons. This shared grief bound them together, but also frayed their nerves, creating a household where the shadows of the past were always present. The house divided. The 1850s saw the issue of slavery move from a simmering debate to a boiling conflict. Lincoln, who had long believed slavery was a moral wrong but a constitutional reality, was galvanized by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He saw the expansion of slavery not just as a political issue, but as a violation of the very Declaration of Independence he held sacred. The Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858 catapulted him onto the national stage. Standing across from the little giant, Stephen Douglas, Lincoln argued that a house divided against itself cannot stand. He lost the Senate race, won the moral argument, positioning himself as the moderate face of the newly formed Republican Party. His election in 1860 was the spark that lit the fuse of the Confederacy. Before he even took the oath of office, 7 states had seceded. He arrived in Washington, D.C. like a fugitive, sneaking into the city in the dead of night to avoid an assassination plot in Baltimore. The man who stood on the unfinished Capitol steps in March 1861 was not yet the great emancipator. He was a beleaguered lawyer trying to hold together a crumbling contract. The weight of the war. The Civil War was Lincoln's Gethsemane. The early years were a succession of disasters: Bull Run, the Peninsula Campaign, the slaughter at Fredericksburg. Lincoln spent his nights in the telegraph office, his face growing gaunt, his eyes sinking into his skull. He was haunted by the butcher's bill. He fired general after general, searching for someone who had the arithmetic to win. In the midst of this national carnage, personal tragedy struck again. His son, Willie, died in the White House in 1862. Lincoln was nearly broken by the loss, often locking himself in Willie's room to weep. Yet, it was through this valley of shadow that his vision for the war changed. He began to see the conflict not just as a war for territory, but as a divine punishment for the sin of slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation was born of this realization, a strategic military necessity that was also a profound moral leap. The final act, the year 1864, was perhaps his hardest. He believed he would lose the re-election. The North was weary of the blood, and the Copperheads were screaming for peace at any price. But Sherman took Atlanta, and the tide turned. Lincoln's second inaugural address, delivered just weeks before his death, was less a victory speech and more a sermon. He didn't blame the South alone. He suggested that every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. His death at Ford's Theater on Good Friday, 1865, was a shock that froze the world. He had lived to see Lee surrender at Appomattox, had walked the streets of a fallen Richmond, and had begun to plan for a charity for all peace. By dying at the moment of triumph, he was elevated from a politician to a symbol. He became the American Moses, who led his people to the promised land of a unified, slave-free nation, but was not permitted to enter it himself.